Rain lashed across the darkened valley as lightning tore through the night sky, illuminating the terror in Lillian Harper's eyes. The old wooden bridge beneath her feet groaned and splintered, timbers cracking like gunshots over the roaring waters of the Snake River. It was 1882 in Wallace, Idaho, and Lillian was about to die until a strong hand seized her wrist as the final board gave way, and she found herself staring into the storm-gray eyes of a stranger. "I've got you, madam," the cowboy shouted over the thunder, his grip unyielding as her body dangled precariously over the churning river below. "Don't let go." Lillian had never planned to die this way, 23 years old, and suspended over raging waters in a territory that had promised new beginnings, but delivered only hardship. As the stranger's muscled arm strained to pull her to safety, she made a silent promise that if she survived this night, she would never take another sunrise for granted. The year had begun with such hope when Lillian left behind the comforts of Boston society, seeking adventure in the untamed West. Her father's passing had left her with enough inheritance to start fresh, and the booming mining town of Wallace had seemed like the perfect place to establish the small dress shop she'd always dreamed of opening. The newspaper advertisements had painted Idaho Territory as a land of opportunity, conveniently omitting the harsh realities that awaited independent women in mining towns. For months, she'd worked tirelessly to build her small business, ignoring the whispers that followed her through town. An unmarried woman with no family to speak of was an oddity in these parts. The townsfolk had been civil but distant, and on this stormy night, she'd been returning from delivering a mended dress to the mayor's wife when the bridge, the only direct path between her modest cabin and town, had begun to give way. "Hold tight." The cowboy called again, his face contorted with effort as he began to haul her upward. Lillian could see now that he was stretched out on his stomach at the edge of what remained of the bridge's entrance, his other hand gripping a support beam as he pulled her towards safety with remarkable strength. When he finally dragged her onto solid ground, they both collapsed in the mud, rain pelting their exhausted bodies. Lillian gasped for breath, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she turned to face her rescuer. "Thank you," she managed between ragged breaths. "I thought I was—" "No need for thanks, madam," he interrupted, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "Name's Jackson Morgan. Most folks call me Jack. We'd best get out of this weather before the rest of this bridge decides to join the river." Jackson Morgan stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build that spoke of years of hard work. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd spent most of his life under the open sky, yet couldn't have been more than 30 years old. Dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, and those remarkable gray eyes assessed her with concern. "Lillian Harper," she replied, accepting his hand and wincing as pain shot through her ankle. "I own the dress shop in town. Appears you've hurt yourself, Miss Harper." Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms. "My horse is tethered just up the road. I'll get you to the doctor." "No," Lillian protested, embarrassment coloring her cheeks despite their dire circumstances. "My cabin is just across the meadow there. It's closer than town, and I can tend to it myself." Jackson studied her face for a moment before nodding. "As you wish, but I'll be escorting you all the same." Her weight seemed insignificant to him as he carried her through the downpour, his stride steady despite the treacherous mud. His horse, a magnificent Palomino, nickered softly as they approached. In one fluid motion, Jackson lifted Lillian onto the saddle before mounting behind her, one strong arm securing her against his chest. "Hold on," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear as they set off toward her cabin. The journey was mercifully short, but by the time they arrived, Lillian was trembling uncontrollably from cold and shock. Her small cabin appeared through the curtain of rain, and Jackson dismounted with surprising grace before helping her down. "You have a key?" he asked as they reached the door. Lillian fumbled in her sodden pocket, producing a small brass key. "Here." Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, the fire having died hours earlier. Jackson wasted no time, setting Lillian gently in a chair before moving to rekindle the hearth. His efficiency spoke of a man accustomed to survival in harsh conditions, and within minutes, flames licked eagerly at fresh kindling. "You need dry clothes," he stated matter-of-factly, turning to face her with firelight dancing across his features. "And that ankle needs looking at." Lillian nodded, suddenly aware of how her drenched dress clung to her frame. "There are blankets in the chest by the bed. I can manage the rest if you'll just." She gestured vaguely toward the door. A hint of a smile touched Jackson's lips. "I'll wait outside with the horse until you're decent." True to his word, he stepped out into the storm, closing the door firmly behind him. Lillian moved as quickly as her injured ankle would allow, peeling off her ruined dress and undergarments before wrapping herself in her warmest nightgown and woolen robe. She had just settled back into the chair with a blanket over her legs when a knock came at the door. "Come in," she called, suddenly self-conscious about her unbound hair falling loose around her shoulders. Jackson entered, water streaming from his duster. Without a word, he hung it by the door and removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her ankle. Lillian hesitated but then nodded. She'd lived independently for too long to be overly concerned with propriety, especially after this man had just saved her life. Jackson knelt before her, his touch gentle as he examined her swollen ankle. "Not broken," he pronounced after careful inspection. "A bad sprain, though. You ought to stay off it for a few days." "That's not possible," Lillian replied with a sigh. "I have orders to complete, and with the bridge gone." "The bridge being out is precisely why you need to rest that ankle," Jackson countered. "You won't be getting to town easily for a while." For the first time, the full implications of the collapsed bridge struck Lillian. The bridge had been the most direct route to town. Without it, she would need to take the long way around a journey of several miles rather than a short walk. "I don't believe I've seen you in Wallace before, Mr. Morgan," Lillian said, changing the subject as she studied his face in the firelight. "Just passing through," he replied, standing to move toward the fire. "I've been driving cattle up from Montana. Stopped in Wallace to resupply before heading to the coast." "A cattle drive in this weather?" Lillian raised an eyebrow skeptically. Jackson's laugh was unexpectedly warm. "No, madam. The drive ended 2 weeks ago in Coeur d'Alene. I'm on my own now, heading west to see about some land near Olympia." "Washington Territory," Lillian nodded. "I hear it's beautiful, so they say." Jackson stoked the fire, adding another log. "What brings a Boston lady to the Idaho wilderness? Your accent gives you away." Lillian smiled, surprised he'd picked up on her origins. "Opportunity, independence, the chance to build something that's entirely my own." Jackson nodded as though he understood completely. "Freedom has its price out here." "As I discovered tonight," Lillian agreed solemnly. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Lillian found herself studying her unexpected guest, the way firelight highlighted the strong line of his jaw, the careful way he tended the fire, the weathered hands that had pulled her from certain death. "You should try to sleep," Jackson finally said. "The storm's not letting up any time soon, and you've had quite a shock." "Where will you go?" Lillian asked, suddenly concerned about sending him back into the tempest. "I'll make do in your lean-to with my horse," he replied with a shrug. "I've slept in worse conditions." "Nonsense," Lillian heard herself say before she could reconsider. "You saved my life, Mr. Morgan. The least I can offer is shelter from the storm. You can sleep by the fire." Jackson's eyes met hers, assessing. "That wouldn't be proper, Miss Harper." "Proper?" Lillian couldn't help but laugh. "I'm a woman living alone in mining country, running my own business. I believe propriety and I parted ways some time ago." A slow smile spread across Jackson's face, transforming his weather-beaten features into something quite handsome. "If you're certain—" "I am," she confirmed. "There are extra blankets in the chest. Make yourself comfortable." As Lillian hobbled to her bed in the corner of the single-room cabin, she wondered at her own boldness. Never before had she invited a man to stay the night, yet something about Jackson Morgan inspired trust. Perhaps it was the way he'd risked his own life to save hers. Or perhaps it was simply the honest integrity she sensed in him. Whatever the reason, as she drifted to sleep to the sound of rain and the occasional soft movements of her guest tending the fire, Lillian felt safer than she had since arriving in Wallace. Morning arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows and illuminating motes of dust, dancing in golden beams. Lillian awoke to the unfamiliar but enticing aroma of coffee and something cooking. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind until the events of the previous night came rushing back. She opened her eyes to find Jackson Morgan moving quietly around her small kitchen area, his back to her as he tended something in a pan over the wood stove. He'd removed his outer shirt, working in just his undershirt, suspenders, and trousers, offering Lillian an unimpeded view of his broad shoulders and strong back. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Jackson turned, spatula in hand, and offered a smile that sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Morning, Miss Harper. Hope you don't mind, but I found some eggs and bacon in your cold box. Figured you could use a hot meal after last night's ordeal." Lillian pushed herself up, wincing as pain shot through her ankle. "Not at all, that's very kind of you." "How's the ankle?" Jackson asked, his eyes dropping to her blanket-covered legs. "Painful," she admitted, "but I'm sure it will improve with time." Jackson nodded, returning to his cooking. "I checked on the bridge at first light. What's left of it won't be passable for some time. Town's effectively cut off from this side of the river unless you're willing to ride 5 miles upstream to the crossing at Wilson's Ford." The news settled heavily on Lillian's shoulders. Her business relied on accessibility, and with the bridge gone, her already precarious financial situation would surely worsen. "Here," Jackson said, interrupting her troubled thoughts as he handed her a plate of perfectly cooked eggs and bacon. "Eat while it's hot." The food was delicious, prepared with a skill that surprised her. As they ate in comfortable silence, Lillian found herself studying Jackson when he wasn't looking. In daylight, she could see details that had been obscured by darkness and rain a small scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the way his hair curled slightly at his temples, the faint laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more often than his serious demeanor implied. "You cook well for a cowboy," Lillian remarked when she'd finished her meal. Jackson chuckled, collecting her empty plate. "When you've spent as many years on cattle drives as I have, you either learn to cook or resign yourself to eating burned beans for months on end." "How long have you been driving cattle?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who'd appeared from nowhere to save her life. "Since I was 16, he replied, washing their plates in the basin. "Started as a wrangler, worked my way up to trail boss by 25. "And now you're heading to Washington to buy land." Lillian pressed, intrigued by the shift in his fortunes. Jackson nodded, drying his hands on a towel. My uncle passed last year, left me a modest inheritance. Not enough to live like a king, but enough to buy a decent piece of land and some starter stock. You're going to start your own ranch, Lillian deduced. That's the plan, he confirmed, a hint of pride in his voice. I've spent enough years working other men's cattle. Time to build something of my own. His words echoed her own reasons for coming to Wallace, and Lillian felt a surprising kinship with this stranger. Both of them were seeking independence, the chance to create something lasting. Miss Harper, Jackson began, his tone shifting to something more serious. I don't feel right leaving you here alone with that ankle and the bridge out. Is there someone in town who might come check on you, a friend or a husband? Lillian finished for him with a wry smile. No, Mr. Morgan. I'm quite alone here by choice, and while I appreciate your concern, I've managed on my own for some time now. Jackson frowned, clearly unconvinced. At least let me ride into town and inform the sheriff about the bridge. He should know, and he might send someone to help you until you can manage that ankle properly. Lillian wanted to refuse. Her independence was precious to her, but practicality won out. That would be kind of you, Mr. Morgan. While you're there, could you inform Mrs. Hollister at the general store that I won't be able to deliver her daughter's dress this week? She's expecting it for the spring dance. Of course, Jackson agreed, already reaching for his duster. Is there anything else you need from town? Lillian hesitated, reluctant to ask more of this man who had already done so much. Perhaps some more coffee. I'm afraid we've depleted my supply this morning. Jackson's smile was warm. Coffee it is. I'll return before sundown. As he prepared to leave, Lillian felt a strange reluctance to see him go. It had been months since she'd enjoyed conversation over breakfast, longer still since she'd felt the curious comfort of another person moving about her space. Mr. Morgan, she called as he reached for the door. Thank you, not just for last night but for all of this. Jackson turned, his gray eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. You're welcome, Miss Harper. Lock the door behind me. With that, he was gone, and Lillian found herself listening to the receding hoofbeats of his horse, already counting the hours until his return. The day passed slowly as Lillian attempted to occupy herself within the confines of her small cabin. She managed to hobble to her workbench, where she continued stitching the elaborate beadwork on Mrs. Hollister's daughter's dress, though she knew now it would be late. The work was delicate and required concentration, which helped keep her mind from wandering too often to thoughts of Jackson Morgan. By mid-afternoon, however, restlessness had set in. Using a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch, Lillian made her way outside to assess the damage from the storm. The air was fresh and clean, with that peculiar brightness that often follows heavy rain. Birds sang enthusiastically in the surrounding pines, and if not for the collapsed bridge visible in the distance, one might never know the violence of the previous night's tempest. Her small garden had survived mostly intact, though some of her young pea plants had been flattened by the downpour. Lillian was carefully attempting to stake them upright when the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Jackson appeared around the bend in the road, his palomino trotting at an easy pace. Behind him, to Lillian's surprise, was a wagon driven by Sheriff Martin Davis. Miss Harper. The sheriff called as they approached. Looks like you had quite the adventure last night. Lillian straightened, leaning heavily on her makeshift crutch. Good afternoon, Sheriff. Yes, it was rather more excitement than I generally prefer. Jackson dismounted in one fluid motion, immediately moving to her side. You shouldn't be out here on that ankle, he admonished softly, his hand instinctively supporting her elbow. I was going stir-crazy inside, she admitted, oddly pleased by his concern. Sheriff Davis pulled his wagon to a stop and climbed down, his perpetually ruddy face serious for once. "Mr. Morgan here rode into town with quite the tale. Says he pulled you from certain death just as the bridge gave way." "He did," Lillian confirmed, glancing at Jackson with gratitude. "I would have been swept away if not for his quick action." The sheriff nodded, his bushy mustache twitching. "Well, the town council's already meeting about rebuilding the bridge. Can't have folks cut off like this. In the meantime, I've brought you some supplies." He gestured to the wagon, which Lillian could now see was loaded with various goods. "Courtesy of the merchants in town. They're concerned about you out here alone." Lillian was touched by the gesture. While she'd always kept to herself, it seemed the townsfolk had noticed her absence more than she'd realized. "That's very kind," she said sincerely. "Please convey my thanks." "Mr. Morgan also mentioned your injured ankle," the sheriff continued, eyeing her makeshift crutch with disapproval. "Doc Sullivan sent these." He reached into his pocket and produced a small packet. "Willow bark powder for the pain and swelling. Says to steep it in hot water and drink it 3 times daily." "Thank you," Lillian said, accepting the packet. "Now, Miss Harper," Sheriff Davis began, his tone shifting to something more official. "I don't feel right leaving you out here alone with that injury and the bridge out. Town's a good 5 miles by the alternate route, too far if you need help." Lillian opened her mouth to protest, but the sheriff continued. "Mr. Morgan here has offered to stay on a few days, help you out until you're mobile again, or until we get that bridge rebuilt. I told him you're a proper lady who might object to such an arrangement, but he assures me he'll make camp outside to maintain proprieties." Heat crept up Lillian's neck as she glanced at Jackson, who was studiously avoiding her gaze. "That's not necessary," she began. "With all due respect, Miss Harper," Jackson interrupted, finally meeting her eyes, "it is necessary. You can barely walk and you're isolated out here. I'm heading west anyway, and a few days' delay won't matter in the grand scheme." There was something in his expression, a mixture of concern and something else she couldn't quite identify, that made arguing seem futile. Besides, a small, traitorous part of her was glad for the excuse to have him stay. "Very well," she conceded, trying to sound reluctant. "If you insist, Mr. Morgan." Sheriff Davis looked relieved. "Excellent. Now let's get these supplies inside before I head back to town." Between the two men, the wagon was quickly unloaded. Lillian was astonished by the generosity of the town merchants' flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, dried beans, even a small crock of fresh butter from the Wilkinsons' dairy. Mrs. Hollister had sent fabric and notions, apparently understanding that Lillian would continue working despite her circumstances. There were even medicines from Dr. Sullivan and books from the town's small lending library. "I had no idea people would be so concerned," Lillian remarked as Jackson arranged the last of the supplies on her shelves. "Folks look out for each other out here," Sheriff Davis replied matter-of-factly. "It's the Western way. You may keep to yourself, Miss Harper, but you're still one of ours." The simple statement affected Lillian more than she expected. Since her arrival in Wallace, she'd maintained a certain distance from the townspeople, assuming they viewed her with suspicion or disinterest. To discover they considered her one of theirs was unexpectedly moving. After the sheriff departed with assurances that he would check back in a few days, Lillian found herself once again alone with Jackson Morgan. A strange awkwardness settled between them as they stood in her small cabin, surrounded by the generous offerings from town. "You didn't need to do this," Lillian finally said, breaking the silence. Jackson shrugged, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It was the right thing to do. "You've already saved my life, Mr. Morgan. You owe me nothing more, Jack," he said, looking up from arranging firewood. "If I'm to be camping on your property for a few days, you might as well call me Jack." Lillian smiled despite herself. "Very well, Jack, and I suppose you should call me Lillian given the circumstances." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Lillian, then." The way he said her name with a gentle emphasis on the first syllable sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. To cover her reaction, Lillian moved to the stove, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. "I should prepare supper to thank you for all you've done," she said, reaching for the newly acquired provisions. "You'll do no such thing," Jack countered, gently but firmly guiding her to a chair. "You need to stay off that ankle. I'll handle supper." "But no arguments," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Consider it part of the service." Lillian found herself obeying, partly because the pain in her ankle was intensifying after her outdoor excursion, and partly because there was something irresistibly compelling about Jack's quiet authority. As he moved around her kitchen with surprising ease, Lillian took the opportunity to study him more carefully. He wasn't classically handsome like the gentlemen who had courted her in Boston, with their smooth hands and perfectly trimmed mustaches. Jack Morgan was rugged, his face weathered by sun and wind, his hands calloused from years of hard work. Yet there was a grace to his movements, a confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. "You're staring," Jack remarked without turning around, amusement evident in his voice. Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was merely observing your cooking technique." His low chuckle told her he wasn't fooled, but he kindly didn't press the matter. Instead, he continued preparing a simple but hearty stew, adding ingredients with the assurance of someone who had cooked the dish many times before. "How did you learn to cook so well?" Lillian asked, genuinely curious. Jack glanced over his shoulder. "My mother died when I was young." "My father was. Not adept in the kitchen. It was either learn to cook or starve." The casual mention of his mother's death was delivered without self-pity, but Lillian sensed the old wound beneath the matter-of-fact words. "I'm sorry about your mother." Jack nodded his acknowledgement but didn't elaborate. "What about you? What brought you all the way from Boston to the wilds of Idaho?" Lillian hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her personal history. But something about Jack, perhaps the fact that he had literally held her life in his hands, made her want to open up. "My father was a professor at Harvard," she began, fingering the edge of her apron. "He believed in education for women, much to the dismay of his colleagues. He taught me literature, mathematics, even some Latin and Greek." "An educated woman," Jack remarked, stirring the stew. "That explains a lot." "What does it explain?" Lillian asked, curious about his perception of her. "The books," he gestured toward her small but well-stocked bookshelf. "The way you speak. The fact that you're running your own business instead of seeking a husband." There was no judgment in his tone, merely observation, which Lillian found refreshing. Most men she'd encountered viewed her independence with suspicion or disapproval. "My father died last year," she continued, finding it surprisingly easy to talk to Jack as he worked. "He left me enough money to start over somewhere new. Boston held too many painful memories and too many expectations for a professor's daughter. I wanted to go somewhere my past wouldn't define me. So you chose one of the most remote mining towns in Idaho territory," Jack finished for her, a hint of admiration in his voice. "The advertisement made it sound quite civilized," Lillian admitted with a small laugh. "I didn't realize booming industry meant muddy streets filled with prospectors and developing community meant 3 saloons for every church." Jack laughed, the sound rich and genuine. The newspapers do tend to embellish when they're trying to attract settlers, especially women. Men will follow where the women go. Well, they neglected to mention the collapsed bridges and flash floods as well, Lillian added wryly. To be fair, I've been traveling through these parts for years, and I've never seen a storm like last night's, Jack said, ladling the fragrant stew into 2 bowls. You were just remarkably unlucky or lucky, depending on how you look at it. Lucky? Lillian questioned as he placed a bowl before her. Jack's eyes met hers, unexpectedly intense. You survived, and… He hesitated, a hint of color touching his tan cheeks. I got to meet you. The simple statement hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that neither was ready to acknowledge. Lillian dropped her gaze to her stew, her heart beating a little faster than normal. This looks delicious, she said, deliberately changing the subject. Jack accepted the deflection gracefully, settling into the chair across from her with his own bowl. It's just a simple trail stew, but it'll fill your belly. The meal was indeed delicious, and conversation flowed more easily as they ate. Jack told her stories of cattle drives across Montana and Wyoming, of sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, of the camaraderie between cowboys who depended on each other for survival. Lillian shared tales of Boston society, of the scandalous poems she would read in secret, of her dreams to someday see the grand cities of Europe. As darkness fell, Jack rose to light the lamps and stoke the fire. I should set up my camp before it gets too late, he said, reaching for his duster. You don't have to sleep outside, Lillian found herself saying before she could reconsider. The weather's still cool and there's plenty of room by the fire. Jack paused, studying her face carefully. That's not proper, Lillian. You know that as well as I do. Propriety seems a small concern when you've already saved my life, she countered, meeting his gaze steadily. Besides, who's to know out here? A slow smile spread across Jack's face, transforming his features. You're not like any woman I've ever met, Lillian Harper. I'll take that as a compliment, she replied, returning his smile. It was meant as one. Jack hung his duster back on the peg by the door, but I'll sleep by the door just the same. As Lillian prepared for bed that night, moving gingerly on her injured ankle, she was acutely aware of Jack's presence in her small cabin. She should have felt uncomfortable having a virtual stranger in her home, yet somehow it felt right. There was a security in his presence, a comfort that went beyond the practical assistance he provided. From her bed, she watched as he spread his bedroll near the door, removed his boots and stretched out, one arm behind his head as he stared at the ceiling. "Good night, Jack," she said softly, blowing out her lamp in the dimness. Illuminated only by the dying fire, she saw him turn his head toward her. "Good night, Lillian. Sleep well." As she drifted toward sleep, Lillian realized that for the first time since arriving in Wallace, she felt completely at ease. It was an unexpected gift, this sense of security and companionship, delivered by a storm that had nearly claimed her life. The irony wasn't lost on her, as she slipped into dreams filled with gray eyes and strong hands that refused to let her fall. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the spring sun warming the small cabin and casting patterns of light across the wooden floor. Lillian awoke to find Jack already up and about, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. He moved quietly, clearly trying not to disturb her sleep, and the consideration touched her. "Good morning," she said, pushing herself up against her pillows. Jack turned, a smile warming his features when he saw she was awake. "Morning. How's the ankle?" Lillian experimentally flexed her foot, wincing slightly. "Better, I think. Still sore, but the swelling seems reduced." "The willow bark tea probably helped," Jack nodded approvingly. You should have another dose with breakfast." As he turned back to the stove, Lillian took the opportunity to observe him unnoticed. In the morning light, with his guard down, Jack looked younger, the hard lines of his face softened. He'd rolled his sleeves to his elbows, revealing tanned, muscular forearms dusted with dark hair. There was an easy confidence to his movements, a man comfortable with physical labor and the simple tasks of daily living. When he approached with a steaming cup of the medicinal tea, Lillian quickly averted her gaze, not wanting to be caught staring again. "Drink this while I finish breakfast," he instructed, handing her the cup.